Hello, everybody, and welcome to In Conversation. I'm James Campbell, and today I'm delighted to be joined by an old friend and frequent collaborator, the indefatigable Professor Bruce Drushel. Bruce, hello, and welcome to you, my friend. It's great to see you, and it's such a pleasure to have you on the podcast. I know you're a busy man, but I'm really glad that we got you here today because we're going to, of course, talk a little bit about your journal with Intellect, Queer Studies in Media and Popular Culture, which I know you're just entering your milestone 10th anniversary volume. So before we go any further, I'd just like to offer you, Kylo, the board, and all the people who've worked on the journal over the years, both my personal heartfelt congratulations and, of course, the congratulations of the whole team at Intellect. We love working on the journal, and I have it as a special place in my heart because I don't know if you can go back longer than those 10 years, actually before 10 years, when me and you first had our first meetings to discuss the journal. But of course, this was actually the first journal that I ever commissioned or began
Wow.
the conversation. So now that I think I'm looking down the barrel at 18 years of work with Intellect, and it was actually all the way back, oh my gosh, all the way back at the start, more or less, when we first met and had those initial conversations about the journal, which then, of course, led to it being contracted. And now we're celebrating its 10th anniversary as an official publication. So I'm really glad that we have the journal in our list, and I'm really glad to have you here on In Conversation today. So hello and welcome and congratulations. How's it going?
Well, thank you. And yeah, may I say it's also a pleasure to see you. I don't see you, it seems like, any more than about once a year. I always look forward to that, but it's nice to, even though we're not in the same room as we would be then, it's nice to be talking.
Yeah, and yeah, that's it. I guess we often see each other at the PCA conferences, which are every April, and I know that you've always been like an area chair there, and that's where, again, one of the reasons why we ended up founding this journal. But yeah, I guess a bit ironic, really. I live in America now. We're on different coasts, but
Ah,
nevertheless, I used to see you more when I was in the UK, I think. But that's the nature of the beast, isn't it? Sometimes.
yeah, that's very different. Well, at least we're in closer time zones. We at least don't have to wake each other up to do something like this.
Well, I do appreciate that because I've had enough early starts this week, so I appreciate you being flexible with the time frame as well. But I know you well, and I know where you're based, but maybe some of our audience don't. So let's begin by just learning a little bit more about you, Bruce. Could you just tell us where you're based, what you teach, and maybe what your core research interests are?
Sure. Well, currently and very recently, I'm based in Westerville, Ohio, which is a suburb of Columbus. And actually, since we talked last, I've retired. So I actually don't teach anymore, at least not in the classroom. I like to think that we're always teaching people something or other, but yeah, I retired from Miami University after 38 years, and that marked also 40 years of full-time higher education teaching for me. I think it was time. But as much as I enjoyed it, it seemed like the proper time. But I wasn't ready to take up shuffleboard and whatever else. I wanted to continue to be active with Popular Culture Association, for instance. And in fact, I having retired and no longer being chair of my department, I now have time to devote to the governing board there, where I serve as secretary, and also to continue work co-editing Queer Studies in Media and Popular Culture, which, as you say, we're now in our 10th volume. And I guess the big difference for me has been the alarm no longer goes off at 5:15 in the morning, and my schedule is a little bit more my own as opposed to being dictated externally. My interests, boy, are broad. I've always been interested in media generally. I can date that back to really when I was about 11 or 12, and I started watching television news and then, reading newspapers. Um, my professional background, actually, before I got into academia, was as a journalist. I worked in radio news primarily, including being a news director. And I actually wanted to get into higher education because this is going to sound very weird, but when you're doing something like that as your primary work, you actually don't have much of a chance to step back and look at it externally. And I missed that. I missed being able to in effect study the industry in which I was working. And so that was really a major driver of my getting into higher education. Um, while I was teaching, I was primarily, well, I was hired to do media policy and law, media management, and to teach also broadcast journalism. Those responsibilities and interests evolved over time. Um, and this kind of matched my evolving research interests as well. And so I began to do more with media history, for example, with representations of gender and sexuality in media, and also just generally, teaching media research methods and that sort of thing. My research interests themselves, again, have kind of migrated. Initially, um, and this kind of anticipates maybe another area that we want to get into. But you know, when I was in graduate school and when I was contemplating leaving graduate school, graduating and entering the job market, and this would have been, the late 1980s. I was aware that even at that time, even though LGBTQ interests were a lot more acceptable and a lot more visible than they had been ever previously, that there still was a bit of a stigma, and there were still places probably that would not hire somebody who listed that as a primary interest. And so there were other areas that I was interested in, including, as I mentioned, media policy and media management and so on. And actually, there were a number of places that were looking for just simply media generalists, and so I applied there as well. I was lucky enough to end up at Miami, where I was able to pursue those interests initially, but then, as many people do, migrate into other areas. Not right away, obviously, because there's always pressure on academicians who are new, um, to stay the course in one particular area, to have a particular one or two streams of research interests. And it's great if those overlap with their teaching interests. And so that sees you through the tenure process and all that. And then after that, you're a little bit more free to look at other areas. And that's pretty much what I was able to do. When the university actually went through a period when they were trying to enhance their diversity offerings in their curriculum. And so I had, up to that point, been, I love to tell this story. I had this file drawer. Well, I actually had just a file folder. It eventually became a drawer, um, where I thought, if I'm ever able to teach a course in LGBTQ media, uh, these are things that will be valuable to me. So I would come across things, whether they be publishers' catalogs or articles that I came across, or even printouts from things that I would see online. They got chucked into that folder, and and so when this opportunity came along, and they were actually willing to give faculty funds to get these courses started up. So if you needed materials like video or whatever, you could get those. Um, and I went to pull out this folder, and I nearly gave myself a hernia because it had grown to be such a really, really thick folder that it literally it had to be subdivided into a lot of other folders. And so my initial question, which was, okay, so if I'm given a 3 credit hour course to teach, how am I going to fill that time in a semester? And then I looked at that folder and I thought, no, the question now becomes, what do I cut out? And and so I taught the course actually a couple times. And it was just a general media course, general queer media. And one of the comments that I got back from the student evaluations after I taught it a couple of times was, "Love the course. Boy, what a shame that you could only devote 2 or 3 weeks to film. Wouldn't it be nice if we had?" And I thought, well, they've got a point. And so I rewrote the course, splitting off film into a completely different course, got that approved. And so I would kind of alternate. I would teach one semester, one another semester. And that also matched my evolving research interests. I had always had kind of an interest in queerness in media, really from the very start. In fact, my first published article was on the early coverage of HIV/AIDS, which, of course, in the late 1980s, there was a lot of it going on. And so that was the first one. And so I sort of then had let that grow fallow, but I was able to kind of reignite that interest and started finding myself writing more and more about that. I think because I just simply had more of an innate interest in it than maybe some of the other things. They, for whatever reason, just were not as interesting to me. And probably a lot of that had to do with, personal interests and so on. But that kind of took off for me. I had a fair amount of success with that. The courses were successful, and so that went on for a few years, and then all of a sudden I got this idea. Maybe we ought to have a journal where people can find articles about these things, content about these subjects more consistently. You don't have to hunt around for little dribs and drabs in various outlets.
Thanks for that, Bruce. And speaking of the journal, this seems like an opportune moment to ask a little bit about its creation and how you ended up founding the publication itself. So the Journal of Queer Studies in Media and Popular Culture has been a significant platform since its inception. But looking back, I wanted to ask you, what about those original goals behind its creation? And how have those goals evolved over time? Can you remember why you kind of started it and how that process has changed as the journal's grown?
Sure. Originally, I will try not to speak for Kylo here, because as you remember the process, we came to you independently with two separate proposals, one dealing primarily with media, the other dealing primarily with popular culture. And you quite wisely suggested that maybe we work together and come up with a single journal that embraced both areas. I think that for me at least, my reasoning for making the proposal was, as I looked around for outlets myself for my own work, there just weren't that many at that time. This was again probably about 12 years ago now that we're talking. And there were two fairly good-sized, well-known journals at that time that dealt with topics in queer studies. One was, and they're both still around. One was Journal of Homosexuality, and the other was GLQ, which originally was called Gay Lesbian Quarterly. The problem, in my view, was that both of them were especially JOH, were very diverse in their scope, and by necessity, because they were the only ones out there. They not only dealt with the humanities and social sciences, as Kylo and I hope to do, but they also had to deal with medicalized issues and science and education and that sort of thing. And whenever you have a journal that has that diverse a scope, two things happen. One is that the readership doesn't necessarily know, if they're looking for one particular kind of thing, where to look for it. It becomes a lot more difficult to find, and there's less of it, so they're probably less likely to subscribe to the journal. And the other thing is, there just simply isn't the space in the journal. Now, JOH, I think, is up to either 6 or 8 issues a year, so and their issues are fairly robust. So, they are devoting a lot of space to work in the area of queer subjects, queer studies, but still they're doing a lot of different kinds of areas of research traditions. So we thought if there were something that were out there that really focused on the humanities primarily and the social sciences to a lesser degree, there was enough work being done that we thought it would not be difficult to find good articles and a steady supply of them to fill a journal. And so that was the original, I guess, reason for or nascence for this journal was we saw a gap in the market, and we thought we could fill it. In terms of how it's evolved over time, certainly there have been other journals, not as many hard copy as we are, but some online that will accept articles dealing with gender and sexuality, particularly minority genders and sexuality. But they again, they're doing that along with a lot of other things. And I think what we have been able to do, and what we have kind of shifted in a sense, is we've been able to kind of track the changes in those areas over time. If I were to look back at our first issue or our first volume of issues and look at the kinds of things that were attracting attention at that time, attracting the attention both of readers and of authors, scholars, they're different than they are now, and which is good. And of course, that's the nature of particularly popular culture.
Mm.
It changes. It's constantly changing. And so the worst thing in the world, I think, is if you picked up an issue from volume 10 and it looked almost identical to the issue, to the issues in volume 1. So one of the things is we've tried to keep pace with things as they've changed. There are, of course, topics that are very resilient, but in which there has been some change, and where there is a need to probe depth, and I think we've been very good at doing that as well. One example I can think of is, and I almost hesitate to bring this up because at times it's been almost the bane of my existence. From the start, we've always done articles on drag,
yeah,
which is of course a very important part of LGBTQ culture. But RuPaul's Drag Race now has a history, I think, at least as long as ours. I think it's longer than ours.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and so from the start, we've gotten articles on RuPaul's Drag Race, and to an extent, after you've read about 5 or 6 of these, you start to say, okay, we got it. We understand. This is what the significance socially and culturally is of this program. So the challenge for us has been to find research that continues to plumb this area. But what new can you tell us about it? How are you interpreting it that is something different than previous scholars have? And so, in some cases, and our reviewers, frankly, are very, very good at scoping this out. So if we get a submission that simply plows the same territory, plows the same field that has been done before, we will send it back to the author, usually with the advice that can you find a kind of a different angle on this? Can you tell us what's new about this, rather than telling us something that we've already seen before. I in my biography for PCA that was published online about a month ago or so, I noted that one of the reasons that I really loved Popular Culture Association was it was always new. And there are um, unfortunately scholarly organizations and conferences that you go to where, it's almost like there was here in the US, there was a popular, well, no longer, but it used to be a popular comic strip called Apartment 3G, which was kind of like a daytime drama, but it was in comic strip form. And there was a joke that oh gee, I haven't read that in years. Oh, well, okay, so it's the next day, and so the idea is you could you could stay away from the conference for any number of years, come back, and still be doing the same things that they had done when you were last there. And that's the thing that we want to avoid. It's bad for the people who go to the conferences, the people who read the journals, and it's equally bad for the reviewers who've seen this all before. We try to keep the topics new and different, and we try to follow as much as possible how they have migrated over time, and maybe even in some cases, we hope, get ahead of that path a little bit.
Yeah, I think you've achieved that very well. Yeah, it's even interesting just thinking about the sort of the nomenclature or the terms we used for the title of the journal and how we looked at the aims and scope. And it was interesting because obviously a lot of these terms are quite loaded and they change over time as they're reappraised or taken on by different groups. And I think that queer studies in media and popular culture actually was the perfect focus, and it's almost kind of come to the fore now. And the Journal of Homosexuality Studies or something feels a bit more kind of like actually more closed in a sense than yours does. But at the same time, I think the journal has had this really important focus, and I think that's helped us develop broader content outside of the journal as well around media and popular culture topics as they relate to queer life, queer culture, and LGBTQ plus issues. So I think it's been a real firebrand actually in a sense, and really showing people that there's a home for that material here at Intellect too. So I applaud you for that as well.
Well, and actually, that's one of the things that has changed even since we started the journal, how the term queer is interpreted. It's actually expanded a good deal. And yes, you're quite right. If you look at the names of Journal of Homosexuality and GLQ, they the aims of those journals, of course, have expanded over time, but sadly the names don't reflect that. And by the time we started the journal, the word queer had pretty much gained widespread acceptance across the LGBTQ plus communities, but it hadn't been too long that had happened. I well remember again being at a conference and being at a caucus meeting when people were debating a change in the name to the caucus, because by that time, we had gotten LGBTQ, and then they were wanting to add a bunch of additional letters, and the proposal had been made, can't we just call it the Queer Studies Division? And you could tell that there was a cleavage that occurred about it was just, I think, a few years younger than I and a few years older than I, that people who were older had a really negative reaction to the term. They remember when the joke was, don't worry about what it means. If you hear somebody say it, just run, and so they were very much against it and really had to be sold on the name. But again, it has become very, very accepted. It's one of those examples of a term that previously had been a term of derision that has been reclaimed.
Yeah.
And of course, the idea, the argument there is, if I call myself that, then all of a sudden it kind of defangs the cobra that you can use against me. You call me queer? Fine. Yeah, I am. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Bruce. And that leads me to my next question. Actually, I think I wanted to ask, Queer studies has grown rapidly in recent years, leading on from our past question about the terminology as well. But why do you think this journal is particularly important at this moment in time, both within academia and public discourse?
Well, this is an example of where just, for all the wrong reasons, we have become much more important. Here in the US, in particular, just in the last year or two, there has been a real effort on an official level to, I think, really combat or be hostile toward LGBTQ people and culture. We saw that first in government, where there were moves made to go after any kind of DEI program, and also to attack just the notion of gender itself. Now, this is a term that has gained almost universal acceptance in not just the humanities and social scientific community, but the scientific community as well, in the medical community. We have for years recognized, for almost a century recognized, that there is a difference between sex and gender, and that's why we use the terms differently and why they have different meanings. But this idea that they are basically the same, and that there are not multiple genders, that there are just two, and they are linked to biology, has come to the fore in many areas of government. And sadly, they have spread from regulations to education policy and social policy as well, to the point that, state universities and libraries can't host drag performances. You have drag shows on university campuses. If it happens to be a state-supported campus, they can't be held. The story times that were hosted by drag performers at libraries for children, those were ruled out. And on a very personal level, somebody like me here in the state of Ohio at my university, I don't know how I could have taught the things that I was taught before, because we were told you can't, in the classroom, you can't teach something that calls attention to, the wrongs that were done to a particular group of people. We're all the same and we all have the same history. Well, that's not true. And it doesn't take very much to see that. But even if I managed to squeeze that in, again, here in Ohio, if there were a student who objected to something that I taught like that, they could, and they expressed that on an evaluation, I could be detenured for it. In other words, I could lose my job. And it's hard to believe that anything that was perceived as positive as diversity and inclusion, are now perceived as toxic. Anyway, this is a long way of saying, with all of that happening, what I think we can do, and what we are doing, is we can provide a platform for discussions of these topics that can't take place elsewhere in at least the official sphere. Now, culture that is not linked to government still makes space for it. We saw that we've seen it most recently with heated rivalry, right? That has become an extraordinarily popular TV series. And it kind of flies in the face of what the government is telling people. But we can provide a platform to talk about things like that. We can provide a platform that tells emerging scholars, hey, if this is something you're interested in, it's not wrong. We're gonna provide a space where you can engage in these conversations, where if you have something that you want to, if you have an area of inquiry that you want to look at, we will entertain that. We will look at it, we will work with you. And by the way, as we're doing that, here are some things that other people have done that you might be interested in. And so, at one time, I think, we saw ourselves as filling a hole. I think here it's become maybe in some respects a little bit more urgent than that.
I would agree, and I think you're also a catalyst. You've always been a catalyst for change, and for giving people reassurance that there is a home for this research. It's important, and that international publishing houses, universities take it seriously. And I think it's important to say as well is that although there's dark times in the United States right now around freedom of speech and things of that nature and educational policies, Intellect, for example, we're a global publisher. This journal is available globally. We publish the work of people from all over the world. And I think that's really important as well, of bringing people together. And also for those people in the US, maybe who are looking to find friends abroad and to make sure that they have a readership elsewhere. And there's other people who've either gone through these same issues around censorship or can offer a different perspective. So I think that's the journal does have a lot more. It's almost like it's more important than ever, as you sort of said, but it can be a catalyst for affecting change and for bringing global voices together. So I think that's such an important part of its mission. Always has been, but it's now perhaps, ironically, we've almost like let our guard down a little bit, thinking that the things are normalized and that we're not going to have to fight these same battles over and over again. But here we are. But I think that gives the journal more purpose and more presence, and shows how important it is right now.
And you're exactly right to bring that up, because one of the other things that has changed about us is where once, we were, I think, a uniquely Western, publication, or we seem to skew that way. Yeah. Articles that primarily were written by either U.S. or Western European authors. We are now seeing so many of our submissions coming from other places around the globe. We are truly a global publication now, and fortunately, we've been able to recruit reviewers who are subject matter experts in some of those regions. So, when we get an article, for instance, a manuscript, for instance, about LGBTQ celebrities in Turkey, we can deal with that. Or how about festivals and celebrations in China? We have people who can deal with that.
Yeah,
really exciting. And in terms of broadening your own interests and broadening your own, I guess, awareness and experience with things, it's been just really a joyful thing for me, because these are things that I never knew about. Frankly, I maybe peripherally knew about, but didn't know in the depth that the authors are bringing to us. And by the way, one of the things that I like most about being an editor is I always love to be surprised. I always told my students that whenever they did a paper, I said, you've told me about the topic you want to write on. I told you it was a good topic. I happen to know a lot about that. So what you can do that will really put you in good stead with me is surprise me. Tell me something that I didn't know about this topic. And it, of course, if you're basically lazy, as I am, it's also a good way of finding out about things without having actually to go out and look for them yourself. They just come to your desk as part of your job.
You're passing down the knowledge. There you go. We can give you. Well, let me ask you then, what about sort of special issues or thematic clusters and anything like that you're focusing on at the moment? Do you have any special issues lined up, or have you just had any that people might be interested in? And then, maybe in addition to that, are there any sort of thematic clusters or themes that you see coming to the fore at the moment?
Well, we've always entertained proposals from people who are interested in special issues, and we've had, sadly, I guess, mixed success in seeing those come to fruition. We've always been very welcoming, but sometimes the people who are trying to put them together, they thought they had lined up authors who could help them out here. Oftentimes, these were based on conferences, conference papers, and then some of their authors have failed to deliver on them. We've had a couple recent proposals that one of which I'm still hoping, well, both of which I'm hoping will come to fruition. One, the title was "Queering the Pitch: Gender, Sexuality, Identity in Professional Sport," and that is such, particularly in the U.S., that is such has always been a taboo topic. The idea that a professional athlete, someone who relies upon, of course, fan popularity and teamwork and so on, while they're active in the sport, and then relies upon endorsement money and so on and public appearances after they retire. That's always been a really hands-off kind of topic, and yet we know that there are an awful lot of lesbian, gay, bisexual people out there, who are in professional sports, and certainly that's true, again, not just in this country but globally. So that's one that we're really eager to see something happen with. If it isn't it looks like it may not be a special issue right now, but if, as you say, maybe a content cluster across a couple issues, perhaps. The most recent proposal that we've seen has to do with the issue of safety in queer spaces, as reflected in literature and film. And what was really appealing to me about that topic is not just that it looks at safety issues and the way they're reflected, but also the fact that it's very historic in nature. The authors here were proposing to really go all the way back to 1900 and look at what's been done in literature and film over the last 125 years or so dealing with these issues. And so, of course, you see an awful lot of change over that time, and yet some of the same consistent issues as you might imagine. So those are a couple examples of things we've seen recently.
Sounds like it's worth me just highlighting, though, that you're in the market for special guest-edited themed issues as long as they're appropriate to the journal's aims and scope. And if people are interested in finding out a bit more about that, probably the best thing to do is either to reach out to you or Kylo directly, but they can find your information and, of course, the submission process, platform, notes for contributors, and all of that good stuff at www.intellectbooks.com, where you'll also have listed the general call for papers and then also any special themed issues that you have lined up. So if anyone's interested in submitting their own idea for a themed issue, or one that's maybe come from a conference or a group of people having a conversation around different topics, do go on the website, check it out, www.intellectbooks.com. Just Google Journal of Queer Studies in Media and Popular Culture, and you'll find all the information there where they can pursue that with you, right?
Exactly. And anybody who is a little bit reluctant to do that, worried that maybe their idea might not be what we're interested in, listen, we're willing to work with people. I mean, we're fortunately, I think nearly every proposal that we've gotten has arrived at our doorstep pretty fully formed and a good fit for the journal. It's nice that people have read up on the journal, they know what we do, and they've come up with something that's a good fit for us. But even if there's something that comes in that is maybe not quite there, we're always willing to work with people to try to mold the project in such a way that it will be a good fit. And we're also there, to support people as well. We can help them out with with processes and answering questions they have. They're still probably going to do most of the work, but we'll be there as a second line of support as well.
Well, I would just like to reassure people after working with you for more than 10 years that I use the word indefatigable to describe you because of your ability and tireless nature when it comes to supporting new and early career researchers as well. And I wanted to just go into that with my next question, really. And I wanted to ask you if you had any advice for anyone who is interested in submitting to the journal, or especially for those who maybe it's their first submission to a peer reviewed journal. Do you have any advice or guidance for ECRs, early career researchers, or just for anyone who's looking to publish either their first article, or maybe give some of those people who have published a few some top tips that maybe they can avoid making the same mistakes?
Sure. Some of this is intuitive, and some maybe is maybe less so to people who might be interested. The first thing I think where this all starts is if somebody has a good idea, to make sure that they have a fairly clear idea of what question it is they want to explore and how they're going to address that question. Now, that seems like a fairly simple and basic piece of advice, but you would be surprised the number of submissions we get where what comes back from the reviewer starts with, "It's not clear to me what the author wants to do here." And so, that's something that really you want to cover in the opening, maybe not the first paragraph, but certainly in the introduction to the manuscript. What is your question, and how are you going to go about addressing that? And that should be fairly specific. The idea is that if we look at that opening paragraph or opening paragraphs, and then we look at the conclusion or the end of the article, that we feel that you have done what you set out to do, and that what you set out to do was meaningful and something that people would be interested in. So that's step one. I think the second step is to make sure that you're pretty well versed in the literature in that area. So you should have read extensively, enough to know a couple things. First, what are the foundational theories that you're going to be dealing with? You would be surprised. Those are not just kind of like an add-on or an extra task or something like that. Those will actually help you in figuring out how you're going to go about addressing the question that you want to address. And it also makes sure that, or reasonably assured, that you won't try to do something that somebody else has already done and maybe done better. So you want to make sure that you're not trying to plow old ground. The second thing is, I already kind of mentioned this, but tell us something we didn't know about this topic. As I said, that's always kind of a moment for joy. That's like Christmas morning for me. And you see the package wrapped in familiar paper and a bow, and then you open it up and it's a surprise. And that's the way I treat a manuscript. If it tells me something that I didn't know, I'm a lot more likely to really be excited about seeing that become something that we publish in the journal than if somebody is telling me something that, this is pretty well known. The next thing is, and I can't emphasize this enough, and you and I have talked about this before, make sure you read the instructions for the authors. These are on our homepage. If you, for whatever reason, can't find them, but can find my email address, write me, I will send them to you. Nothing turns us off quicker than to receive a submission that it's quite obvious they haven't read anything about the way we want to get our submissions. One of the things, so we don't do endnotes or footnotes in our articles. We like the material to be integrated in the text of the manuscript. So when I get a manuscript that has 2 pages of footnotes at the end of it, or endnotes at the end of it, I know that first, they haven't read the instructions, and second, that there's going to be a lot of work they're going to have to do in order to make that article publishable. And in fact, I'm probably not even going to send it out for review until they have done that, because it's going to make such a difference in the way the piece reads, because they're going to have to find some way of integrating that material into the text. And my final thing is proofread your submission before you send it in. I shouldn't have to do that, but you'd be surprised the number of manuscripts that come in.
I'm not surprised at all. I'm not surprised at all, Bruce. I'm not. I mean, and I'm the first one to put my hand up and say that I'm perhaps not the most organized, and I definitely need to pre-review and proofread things extra times. But yeah, I used to say, I'm sorry, I don't mean to patronize, but I've given up on that. The amount of people who submit to journals across the board who miss some of the real basics, and unfortunately, it often really tarnishes your reputation. And sometimes I just don't think people understand quite how important it is, especially these days, because journals, are under a lot of pressure to sustain themselves and be successful. It's a difficult marketplace for journals, and there's more competition than ever before in many respects. And it's a huge amount of work for the editorial teams and the editorial boards, many of whom are working for free or who are getting paid a royalty or something like that, but it's not a full-time employed role necessarily. Certainly isn't a particularly lucrative one. So a lot of the editors are doing this for the love. So if you submit something that's clearly you haven't looked at any of the stipulations, the rules and regulations, it almost can offend an editor sometimes, because they're giving up so much of their time to help, and if it's a good editor, they'll be collegial and help you develop the work alongside with the peer reviewers. So there's a lot of energy going into that. So if you haven't submitted the basics, or it doesn't even fit the aims and scope of the journal, you're setting yourself up for a mighty fall. So I would agree with everything you're saying, and say, just the best bit of advice I ever give people, I think, is just, read notes for contributors. Any questions, reach out to the journal or the publisher, and just be really careful, and ask a friend to give it a quick peer review. Make sure you haven't spelt your own name wrong, that kind of thing, which does happen.
Well, or the one that really frustrates us is when people with names will come up with inconsistent spellings of names of people.
Yeah.
And here's the thing about proofreading that maybe people don't quite get. If I see a manuscript that is full of misspellings, those are fairly obvious things, and then it causes me to question what else about the manuscript isn't right. And it makes me more likely to go and make sure that they have, that their sources are correct, and that sort of thing. So, it's one of those things that it's fairly easy to get right, from the get-go. And it really does make a positive impression, not only on the editors, but also on the reviewers. Those little squiggly lines, in the manuscript. Okay, those are there for a reason. If they're there because the program thinks you've misspelled something. Now, if it's a name, they may not be familiar with it, but if it's not a name, chances are you misspelled a word.
Well, Bruce, thank you so much for sharing all of this information with us, both about the journal, about your own history with the publication, and your own research interests. Really looking forward to see what comes out of the next 10 years. I just want to urge people to take a look at the website as well, www.intellectbooks.com, because you can download a free issue of the journal there, as well as see all the previously published articles. Any that are open access, of course, will be freely available as well. So I really urge people to do that, just to pique their own interest, regardless of whether they're interested in submitting or not. I'm not going to let you off the hook quite yet, though, because I have a few more questions, a few quick time questions for you to answer. But before we jump into that section of the podcast, I was just wanting to ask you if you had any final thoughts or anything you'd like to say about the journal before we move on.
Well, the first thing is and I'm not pandering here at all, but I'm very grateful to you and to Intellect for all the support that you've given us over the years. Quite clearly, the journal, whatever success it has had, would not have been possible without that support. And so I know Kylo and I are very, very grateful about it. And we're also grateful to the people who have thought enough to subscribe, including recommending it to their libraries, because that is awfully, awfully important. And also to the people who have seen it as a venue that they would like to write for, that that it's a place they would like to see their material appear. It would not be a journal if we didn't have good stuff to put in it, and so we're very grateful to our authors. I know that in the publication process, we're always I think fixated on congratulating people when it's become publishable and that type of thing. We should also add to that thank you, because again, if they had not gone to the work they'd gone to, we wouldn't have a good article that would attract readers and it would keep us in business.
It's literally built on the words of your contributors. Yeah, I think that's a really nice sentiment. Well, thank you very much, Bruce. We really appreciate you sharing all of that. It's been such a pleasure having you on. But like I said, you're not leaving us yet, so I'm going to jump right in with a few quick time questions. So I wanted to ask you, I've met you in a few cities and places around the world, probably Turkey, Finland being the most far-flung place where we've both been at the same time. But I wanted to ask you, do you have any favorite cities, and why are they your favorites?
Yeah. Well, let me just say, for one, that Turku is a wonderful place, and it's probably not on anybody's list, but if you have a chance to go to Finland, period, or really any part of Scandinavia, do it, because amazing people there, amazing things to see. And even though Turku historically was very important, because it was the former capital of Finland. But even now, it's a wonderful cultural center, and it's a beautiful place and beautiful people. So, but my favorite city is actually one that you and I have not been in at the very same time, and that's Vancouver, British Columbia. Have you been there?
It's a favorite of mine too. Interesting, yeah.
And the reason for me is I often tell people it's the one city that I've been to that actually outdid its billing. People talk about what a nice place it is, and I loved it because it seems like within just a few steps, or at least a few blocks, you are in such different kinds of places. It has one of the largest Chinatowns, for instance, in North America. It has an amazing shopping area. You have skiing, within a very short place. Native American or native monuments and that sort of thing. Native culture is very prominent there. When you just come into the town and you look at the downtown area, the area near the coast, it is such a wonderful, modern-looking city. It is beautiful, and of course, the weather most of the year is very nice. Now, they go through their rainy periods and that type of thing, but particularly in the summer, there is no better place, and the flora and fauna are just unparalleled.
Well, I agree with all of that. It's such a wonderful city. I love the fact that it feels like a seat for education and knowledge, like access to those kind of temperate rainforests, to Vancouver Island, to the coast. Tremendous. Food, exceptional. Big Chinese, but also Japanese and Pan-Asian populations. It punches above its weight in terms of the size, like you say, indigenous culture, heritage, history, monuments. Oh, it's a truly spectacular place, yeah. And I agree. I tend to try and go at least once a year. I often have business to do there because, of course, like I said, with the knowledge production, there's some fine universities there, both on the mainland and on Vancouver Island. So it makes a lot of sense for us to go and visit, which I'm always pleased. But we'll just have to coincide a visit at some point, Bruce.
Yeah, I would love that.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you another one then. I can't remember if we've spoken much about music in the past, but I was wondering, are you a fan of music? And if so, what's one of your favorite genres?
I am a fan of music, and my interests are fairly eclectic. My spouse and I listen to jazz kind of in the background for our evening meal. We've gotten in that habit, except around the Christmas season, we had Christmas carols going. But my favorite kinds of music, this is going to sound very bifurcated, but there is some reason for it. I love 60s pop a lot. And a lot of that is just, for me, it's very nostalgic because I can remember growing up, being in the back seat of the car when we were going someplace and my parents having what at that time was top 40 music playing. And so it's music that kind of takes me back to a really wonderful period of my life. The other part of my favorite is actually 70s and 80s new wave music. And the reason that I say that is probably not the sharp departure that it might seem like from 60s pop. I think one of the reasons that I like new wave is that it is kind of deconstructed music. and in many respects, has qualities that resemble 60s pop. I'm not a musicologist, so I'm not qualified to say much more about that, and I get quickly out of my depth. But I think there are similarities there that make it part of just a kind of a seamless progression for me.
Oh, that's a great answer. Yeah, my spouse and I definitely listen to a lot of kind of music at dinner time and made that a big focus. But yeah, I'm a big fan of hip hop and funk and various genres that are more beat driven. But I love new wave and post punk music. But yeah, new wave is I always go back to it. I have done since I was a kid. I guess I was slightly raised on it because my mum and dad had quite a lot of new wave playing when I was a young kid, born in '83, and then of course it's had such an influence on a lot of bands, especially kind of indie pop bands in the early 2000s and things like that too. So it kind of had a big resurgence when I was cutting my teeth, coming of age. So it's not a surprise. But yeah, I'll be listening to the likes of Nas and classic New York hip hop, and then I'll be straight over to Soft Cell or to New Order and to various other bands like that. And I think it's pretty cool because it does incorporate quite a wide range of different bands from that sort of kind of post-punk world. And yeah, a lot of them you know is new wave right away, but others you're like, oh yeah, that's kind of intriguing. So cool answer. Lends me on to my next question actually quite nicely, because maybe we've talked about music playing in the background. I wanted to ask about a dinner party, and if you could host a dinner party, I'm going to limit you here to 5 guests. Now these guests can be dead, they can be alive, doesn't matter if you've met them or not, but you can get this magic invite list, guest list for 5 guests. Who's going to make the cut? Who are you going to invite and why?
Well, we're going to have to disinter most of my guests, unfortunately. Yeah. But I really do have a rationale for each of them. First on my list would be Theodore Roosevelt, and that may seem to be kind of an odd choice, but I admired first his love of the outdoors and his penchant for trying to preserve it as much as possible. But I also like the stance that he and his administration, those around him, took on the Gilded Age. I mean, he really did try to start a reform movement that got us away from, at that time, millionaires. Today they would be billionaires running everything and disregarding the health and well-being of everybody else. So he's kind of my political person. Robert Frost, whose poems I have always enjoyed, and I know that sounds a little bit simplistic, but kind of similar to my devotion to 60s pop and kind of an earlier time and nostalgia. I always come back to some of his work. He truly was a wonderful poet. Norman Lear, I guess he is kind of a mix of cultural and political. He's the man, of course, who gave us television in the 1970s in particular, all the way from All in the Family and Sanford and Son to Good Times, Jefferson's One Day at a Time, Hot L Baltimore, which was based upon the play. But he truly changed the nature of television in this country in the 1970s and brought politics to the fore. Prior to his programs, television seemed to ignore the fact that there was a growing generation gap. There were concerns about issues like war and so on. And so I've always, and really all the way through his life after those shows and up to his death recently, he was a person of, to me, extraordinary character, and he never forgot the little guy, which I think is great. Okay, the next two, Eartha Kitt, and I have always admired first her talent, and if you've ever listened to any of her recordings or seen any of her videos, you can't help but first recognize them straight out. I mean, nobody ever hears anything that she has done and think, oh, I can't, now who is that's doing that, and guess it wrong. She is so distinctive that you instantly know it's an Eartha Kitt song. And I admire the fact that she lived through the horrible blacklisting that she did in the US in the 1960s, that owed to her being just very honest about her feelings about the Vietnam War and racism and so on. But I had another reason for really liking her and wanting to have her at that dinner party and having a chance to talk to her. She was the, when I first came out, and I finally got up the courage to go to a gay bar. It was in Columbus, oddly, since I've kind of come full circle, come back to this area. The bar is no longer, by the way. But when I remember figuring out where the bar was. It was mentioned on a television newscast. This was during a political campaign, and we had a gubernatorial candidate in Ohio who was very anti-gay, and so they were interviewing people outside of the bar, and they had the address, and I thought, oh, okay, so it wasn't that far a drive at that time, and I thought, okay, I'm going to go up there, and I remember parking not far from the bar, and after having driven by it a couple times and then walking by it a couple times before I finally got up the courage to go in, because it was a very foreboding place. I mean, the window, as they were at that time, the windows were all blacked out and so on, and no name on the door. Anyway, I went in, and there was an Eartha Kitt video playing on a large screen in the entrance to the bar, and I thought, oh my God, I am home. So she would be my fourth guest and my fifth, and I have no other reason except that I would want to engage her in conversation just enough to hear her talk, and that's Joanna Lumley.
Fair enough. Great show, Joanna.
There is nobody who speaks the English language more musically and more delectably than Joanna Lumley.
Well, I won't argue with you there. That's for sure. Well, what a lovely dinner party that's shaping out to be, and I love each of those answers. They're all fantastic. So thank you for sharing that with us. I do have one final question for you today, though, and this actually I've asked a few people this recently, and it comes from a conference because someone came directly up to me, and I thought they were going to say, "How much is this book?" or "Why are you not publishing more open access?" or something along those lines, and instead they came right at me. Time travel. If you could travel through time, would you go backwards or would you go forward? And what would you hope to see? And I thought, crikey, I wasn't expecting that question. I'm going to ask everyone that who comes on my podcast moving forward. So I'll give you it again, Bruce. So, if you could travel through time, would you go backwards, or would you go forward? And what's your sort of rationale for that?
Well, given my love of history, and particularly my love of queer history, it probably is not going to be a surprise that I would want to go back in time.
Okay.
And probably even less a surprise that I would want to go back to late June 1969 and Greenwich Village, New York, to the Stonewall Rebellion. It would be a very frightening thing to witness. I don't know how close I would want to get to it, but it just to see something as significant historically as that. This was the first time that lesbian, gay, transgender people stood up to the cops who were trying to essentially enforce a criminal system. The bars that were run by the mob, that were the only ones that could exist, because otherwise you couldn't have a gay bar in New York. But to be there, to see that energy, to see that commitment, and ultimately to see that success would be just a singular experience. And so that's where I would like to be, maybe a couple blocks away.
and a hugely important lesson from history, lest we not forget, especially not at the moment. And I think, for anyone who doesn't know the history of the movement, I think people should go and have a little Google and learn a little bit about that history and that important protest that went on. Well, Bruce, what a pleasure it's been to have you on the podcast. It's been such a pleasure, as always, just chatting about the journal, one of my favorites that we publish. And of course, great to get your perspectives on some of these more lighthearted questions. Wonderful answers they've all been. So I just want to urge everyone to go online, take a look at the Journal of Queer Studies in Media and Popular Culture. Open call for papers, general call, and as Bruce said earlier, very open to themed issues, special edited issues as well. So if you want to edit an issue yourself, come and submit a proposal. But just in general, the journal is open to a vast array of different media and pop culture topics, including legacy and, of course, new, evolving, cutting-edge technology and all of that stuff too. So I really urge people to take a look, whether you're early career, old career, retired career, wherever you are in your career, we'd love to hear from you. But I'd like to just say again, huge congratulations to you, to Kylo, and to the rest of the team on what's now 10 plus years really. Hugely important, and a journal its importance is only increased, if anything, and its impact certainly has. So a huge thank you and a big congratulations. And again, just thanks so much for your time, for joining me today on In Conversation. Do you have any final thoughts, Bruce?
Only to say thank you so much. The pleasure has been mine, and I hope to see you in Atlanta in a few months.
I will see you in Atlanta, and to everyone listening, we will see you next time here on In Conversation. Bye for now.